The boy had never been on a train before the morning they lined him up and told him not to speak unless he was spoken to. To 8-year-old Thomas McCarthy, the locomotive at the end of the platform looked less like a machine and more like some black iron animal, hissing clouds of white breath into the September air. The year was 1854. The place was Lower Manhattan, where the streets around the Five Points district still smelled of sewage, coal smoke, and too many people jammed into too little space. The train, the men in dark coats kept telling them, was his chance. His chance at a bed, his chance at steady meals, his chance at a future that did not begin and end in alleys. What nobody explained clearly was that once his boots left the city platform and touched the wooden steps of that carriage, Thomas would become something else. Not just a passenger, not just a child under care. In the eyes of many of the people waiting at the other end of the line, he would become a body to be inspected, a pair of hands to be tested, a mouth to be assessed for teeth and obedience, something as close to livestock as the law would allow without using the word. The morning had begun long before the station. Thomas woke in the cramped dormitory of the Children's Aid Society lodging house, one of 40 boys stacked in 3-tier wooden bunks that smelled of straw, sweat, and cheap carbolic soap. He had been brought there 6 weeks earlier by a thin man from the mission who found him sleeping in a doorway on Mulberry Street. Before that, his memories came in jagged flashes. His mother coughing herself to death in a cellar room during a typhoid outbreak. His father crushed between 2 wagons on the docks. The brief, disorienting terror of being truly alone in a city that barely noticed him when he was present and would not notice at all if he disappeared. At the lodging house, they had given him a bath, a bowl of stew, and a Bible story. They had also given him a new shirt, a pair of second-hand boots that almost fit, and a lesson he was reminded of every night. You are one of the lucky ones. There are hundreds of children out there who would take your place. The words were meant as comfort. They sounded like a warning. In the weeks that followed, he learned the rhythms of the place. Up at dawn, bed rolled and blankets folded, lines for porridge, hymns before meals. During the day, older boys were sent out to shine shoes or carry messages. The smaller ones, like Thomas, spent hours copying letters on slate or listening to lectures about thrift, obedience, and the virtues of hard work. On more than one occasion, he heard the name of the man who had built all this, the Reverend Charles Loring Brace, spoken with a kind of reverence. Brace, they said, believed that the streets were no place for children. Brace wanted to save them from hunger, crime, and sin by sending them out west, where the air is clean and honest work is waiting. Thomas did not know where out west was. To him, the world ended at the edge of the island and the dark water of the Hudson River. There were hints that something big was coming. The matron started measuring the boys by height, separating those who could pass for strong enough to work in a field from those who were still obviously too small. They inspected hair, teeth, and hands. A boy with a limp was quietly sent to a different ward. 2 brothers, one dark-skinned, one pale, were told they would not be traveling together after all. Farmers prefer a certain look, one woman said, before catching herself and lowering her voice. The night before the train, the atmosphere in the dormitory changed. Instead of the usual restless shuffling and whispered jokes, there was a tight, brittle energy. Some boys were excited. "I heard you each get your own pony," one claimed, "and a big bed with white sheets." Others clung to their blankets and stared at the ceiling, eyes wide open in the dark. A few cried quietly into their pillows, trying not to be heard. Thomas did not cry. He lay awake and tried to imagine what it meant to have a family again. The people from the society had told them that families out west were waiting for them. Good Christian people who wanted nothing more than to take in boys and girls, give them clean clothes, and teach them honest trades. "You are not being given away," one pamphlet said. "You are being placed." The word sounded gentle, like putting a book back on a shelf. Just before dawn, the church bell down the street tolled 5 times. The matrons moved through the dormitory with lanterns, shaking shoulders. "Up, boys," one called. "Up and dress. Today is the day." They were given better clothes than usual, sturdier boots, thicker shirts, jackets that had seen less wear. Each child received a small paper tag pinned to the coat lapel with a number written in careful ink. Thomas's tag read simply, 27. He traced the numbers with his finger, feeling the rough fibers of the paper. "Remember," a supervisor told them as they lined up in the courtyard, "you will speak politely, you will smile, you will not lie, and you will be grateful. The Lord has opened a door for you." They marched through streets that were just waking up. Shopkeepers were raising shutters, carts rattled over cobblestones, dock workers trudged toward warehouses. A few people stopped to stare at the column of children, most of them under 12, walking in pairs with their luggage. Small bundles of clothes, a Bible, sometimes a toy that had survived the culling of possessions. Some adults smiled, some frowned. A few muttered things Thomas couldn't quite catch. Better for them. Shipping them off. Cheaper than poorhouse beds. The station was louder than anything Thomas had experienced. Steam hissed from valves, iron wheels clanged. Men shouted orders over the din. The smell was a thick mix of coal smoke, oil, horse manure, and humanity. The children were herded toward a siding where 3 passenger cars waited, their paint flaking but their windows scrubbed clean. Above them, on a signboard, someone had chalked the words, "Special Western Placement." On the platform stood a small knot of men in dark coats, some with collars turned up against the chill. One of them, a bearded man with intense eyes and a high forehead, stepped forward as the children approached. "Good morning, boys and girls," he said, voice carrying easily over the noise. "Today, your lives begin anew. No more alleys, no more hunger. You are going to homes where you will be loved and taught to work. The world out there needs you. And remember, God goes with you." Thomas realized this must be Brace, the man so many pamphlets had praised. He did not look like a villain from the penny dreadfuls some boys shared under blankets. He looked tired, determined, convinced. Tickets were not checked. Names were not called. Instead, the supervisors moved down the line, reading the numbers on each child's chest and ticking them off against a list. 46 children all told, they said. 29 boys, 17 girls, ages from 4 to 15. By the time the last number was marked, the conductor was already glancing at his pocket watch with impatience. Time was money. Track space was not free. "On board now," the matrons urged. "Quickly!" Inside the carriage, the seats were wooden and hard but clean. The children crowded 3 to a bench, clutching their bundles. Windows framed the city in moving pictures as the train lurched and began to roll. Brick tenements, church spires, the brief gleam of the river. As the buildings thinned, giving way to fields and scattered houses, the excited chatter faded. Some boys pressed their faces to the glass. A few girls fell asleep with heads on each other's shoulders. Thomas watched until the city disappeared behind a bend, then turned inward. "Do you think they'll send us all to the same town?" the boy next to him asked. His name was Eddie. He still had both parents somewhere. They had signed papers after losing their home, believing their son would be cared for until they could take him back. At least that was what Eddie whispered when he thought the supervisors weren't listening. "I don't know," Thomas said. "I hope so," Eddie muttered. "Would be bad to get stuck alone." Hours later, when the train finally slowed and the conductor shouted the name Dowagiac, they would find out what alone meant in this new system. Because waiting on that small Michigan platform would not be a line of gentle families with open arms and adoption papers. It would be a crowd of farmers, shopkeepers, and townspeople who had read handbills promising good Protestant children from the East available to be taken into respectable homes. Some would indeed want sons and daughters. Others would want field hands, kitchen help, or factory labor that cost less than a grown man's wage. They would step forward as the children were lined up again, tags still on their coats, and they would look them over the way a buyer looks over horses. They would ask their ages, their strengths, whether they could milk a cow or scrub a floor. They would lift chins, prod shoulders, turn small hands palm up to inspect for calluses. And somewhere in the middle of that first crude marketplace for human futures, an 8-year-old boy from 5 Points named Thomas McCarthy would begin to understand that being placed could mean many things, and that once the train left again, whatever choice was made on that platform might be the last anyone in New York ever heard of him. When the train finally sighed to a stop, Thomas thought for a second that his heart had stopped with it. Outside the carriage windows, there was no Manhattan, no forest of brick and smoke. There was a low, wooden platform, a strip of cinder and mud, and beyond that, fields that seemed to go on forever, broken only by a few bare trees and the thin line of a road. A painted sign on a post read Dowagiac in letters big enough that even the younger children could sound them out. The sky was a hard, pale blue. The air smelled different, less coal, more damp earth and animals. "Stay seated until you are called," one of the matrons ordered, though half the boys were already craning their necks to see. "Remember your numbers. Remember your manners." Through the smudged glass, Thomas could see the crowd waiting on the platform. There were maybe 30 people, more men than women, all in Sunday clothes, even though it was the middle of the week. Some held Bibles, others had folded newspapers or nothing at all in their hands, as if they had come empty on purpose. A few had children of their own standing beside them, gripping their skirts or coat sleeves. Most of the faces were unreadable. A few were openly appraising, eyes narrow, jaws set. The conductor slid the door open with a jerk. Cold air flooded the compartment. "All right then," he muttered. "New York children, out you come." They were herded off the train in a stumbling line, boots clumping on the wooden planks. The matrons reorganized them into a neat row that stretched almost the length of the platform. Boys on one side, girls on the other. Each child stood with hands folded or at their sides, paper tag pinned neatly over the heart. Thomas found himself between Eddie and a girl of about 10, with pale braids and red-rimmed eyes. The man from the society, the one Thomas thought must be Brace, had not come with them. He had stayed in New York to send more trains, perhaps. In his place, a local minister stepped forward, black coat buttoned to the throat, a Bible tucked under his arm. "Friends," the minister said, raising his voice to the assembled townspeople, "as you know, these children come to you from the crowded and sinful streets of the East. They have been rescued from vice, hunger, and neglect. Here, among God-fearing folk, they may learn honest work and Christian values. Treat them kindly, and the Lord will bless you." He turned to the children. "You are to be respectful," he said. "These folks may choose to take you into their homes. You owe them obedience and gratitude. Remember that you were spared from worse." There was a murmur, a shifting of boots. Then the practical part began. A man with a ledger and a stub of pencil walked slowly along the row of children, calling out numbers and names. As each number was spoken, the child took one step forward and repeated it, voice shaking or steady, depending on the courage left in their chest. When the man reached Thomas, he squinted at the tag. 27, he read. "Thomas McCarthy, age 8, Irish." Thomas swallowed. "Sir," he said. The label hung in the air like smoke. Irish. Out here, that word could mean many things. Hard worker, papist, trouble. In 5 points, it had simply meant everyone he knew. On this platform, surrounded by strangers, it felt like another weight. "Strong enough," the ledger man said to no one in particular, then moved on. Only when the last name was read did he close the book and nod to the crowd. "You may come forward now," he said. "Remember, these are children, not animals. This is not an auction." What followed looked very much like one anyway. They came in 2s and 3s at first, farmers with sunburnt faces and big, rough hands, their wives neat in calico dresses, a storekeeper with ink on his cuffs, a widow in a black bonnet. They walked slowly along the line, pausing where a child's face or height caught their eye. Questions were asked in low voices. "How old is he? Can you read? Do you know how to milk a cow? Can she sew, wash clothes, mind little ones?" Hands touched shoulders, turned chins up to the light. One man asked a boy to lift a sack of feed as a test. The boy strained, arms shaking, then managed to haul it a few inches off the ground. The man nodded and spoke to the ledger keeper. The boy's number was written down. He was led away, eyes wide, leaving a gap in the line that closed quickly. "Near Thomas," Eddie whispered through stiff lips. "They're buying us," he said. "Taking us," Thomas muttered back. "That's what they said. Taking, buying. Feels the same from here." A woman with kind eyes and a tired smile stopped in front of the girl with pale braids. "What's your name, dear?" she asked. "Anna, ma'am," the girl whispered. "Can you help in a kitchen? Look after a baby?" "Yes, ma'am," Anna said. "I helped my aunt before." The woman's gaze flickered to Anna's tag. "Number 15, yes? I'll take her," she said to the ledger man. "My husband's been alone with 3 little ones since I was called to help my sister. We could use another pair of hands." Anna was led away, not quite smiling, not quite crying, clutching her small bundle of possessions. Thomas watched her go until the crowd swallowed her up. Some children went quickly. The youngest girls especially were snapped up by families looking for help and, sometimes, someone to dress in lace and sit in the front pew. Strong boys, around 10 to 12, drew interest from farmers who eyed their shoulders and forearms, calculating how many rows they could plow in a day. Others were passed over. A boy with a pronounced limp stood straighter each time someone approached, only to see their eyes slide past. A dark-skinned child heard the same words 3 times in different mouths. "We're not sure the neighbors would approve." A freckled girl with a fierce scowl earned a muttered, "That one looks like trouble," and was left where she stood. Hour bled into hour. The crowd thinned as choices were made and names were entered in the ledger. Each selection felt permanent in a way Thomas couldn't yet articulate. Once a number was written down next to a family name and an address 2 states away, what paper trail existed in New York would be updated. If someone remembered, if someone bothered. If not, a small body could simply vanish into this vast, flat land and never reappear on any clerk's list. When a tall man with a weather-cracked face and calloused hands stopped in front of Thomas, the boy forced himself not to flinch. The man studied him for a long moment, eyes moving from face to boots and back again. "You ever worked a field?" the man asked. "No, sir," Thomas said. "But I can learn. I can carry. I'm strong." The man reached out and wrapped one large hand around Thomas's wrist, feeling the bone and muscle. His grip was firm but not cruel. "Lost my oldest last winter," he said, more to himself than to the boy. "Pneumonia took him in 3 days. Could use another pair of hands come harvest." He glanced at the ledger man. 27, he said. "I'll take this one." Thomas felt the world tilt, as if the platform had dropped away under his boots. The matron who had marched them from the train stepped forward with a practiced smile. "Very good, Mr. Talbot," she said. "This is Thomas. He is a bright boy. I'm sure he'll be a blessing to your household." A blessing. A replacement. A worker. She pressed a folded paper into the man's hand, a receipt with Thomas's name, number, and a brief note about his orphan status. Somewhere, back in a New York office, a copy would go into a file. Whether anyone would ever open it again was another question. "Say thank you, Thomas," the matron prompted. "Thank you, sir," Thomas said automatically. Talbot nodded once. "Come on then," he said. "Wagon's out front. It's a good ways to the farm." As they walked away from the platform, Thomas looked back once over his shoulder. The line of children was shorter now. Gaps where bodies had been. Faces he would never see again. Eddie still stood near the end, tag crooked, eyes scanning the crowd for someone, anyone, who looked like they might be good. "Don't worry, boys," the ledger man called to the ones left. "There's more trains, more towns. Someone will want you." The words were meant as reassurance. They sounded to Thomas like a threat stretched out across miles of track. He climbed into the wagon, next to a stranger who now owned the next chapter of his life. Behind him, the locomotive exhaled a long, lonely whistle, gearing up for the rest of its route. More stops, more platforms, more children to be lined up and chosen until all 46 were gone and the train could return to New York empty, or ready to be filled again. 3 months after Thomas stepped off that train in Dowagiac, his name disappeared from the official records kept by the Children's Aid Society in New York. Not by accident. Not because someone made a clerical error or spilled ink over a ledger page. His name was removed because the system was designed, from the very beginning, to let children slip through its cracks and vanish into a vast, indifferent landscape, where nobody asked too many questions and nobody followed up unless someone complained loud enough and long enough to be heard. In the carefully worded reports published by Reverend Brace and his colleagues in the years after that first train rolled out of Manhattan, there were numbers. 46 children placed in Michigan in September 1854. Within 2 years, another 207 sent west. By 1860, the count had swelled to over 3,000. The annual reports listed towns, listed counties, listed the broad categories of placement: farmer, merchant, respectable household. What they did not list, most of the time, were last names, street addresses, or any mechanism for actually checking whether a child sent to a farm near Kalamazoo was thriving, suffering, or dead. That omission was not negligence, it was policy. The Children's Aid Society operated on a philosophy that Brace articulated over and over in speeches, pamphlets, and fundraising letters. The West was salvation. Fresh air, open land, hard work, and Protestant values would transform street urchins into upstanding citizens. To micromanage that transformation, to send inspectors knocking on farmhouse doors, to track every child year after year, would undermine the whole premise. It would suggest that these placements were experiments, not solutions. It would cost money the society did not have. And worst of all, it might uncover failures that would make donors hesitate. So instead, the society relied on a light touch. A few months after placement, a polite letter might be sent to the family who had taken a child, asking how things were going. Sometimes there was a reply. More often there was silence. If silence stretched too long, someone might make a note. No response from Talbot Family, Michigan. Assume placement satisfactory unless notified otherwise. Assume. That word did a lot of heavy lifting. By 1856, 2 years after that first train, a pattern had begun to emerge. Of the original 46 children sent to Michigan, at least 12 had already moved, relocated by their new families to another county, another state, sometimes under a new last name that better fit the family Bible, or avoided awkward questions from neighbors. A few had been sent back east after failing to adjust, though records of where they ended up were hazy at best. One girl had died of scarlet fever. Her grave, if it existed, carried no marker anyone in New York ever saw. Thomas McCarthy's file, such as it was, contained exactly 4 lines of information. Number 27, Thomas McCarthy, age 8, orphan, placed with Elijah Talbot, farmer, near Dowagiac, Michigan, September 1854. Follow-up letter, sent December 1854. No reply received. File closed, February 1855. File closed meant that as far as the Children's Aid Society was concerned, Thomas was no longer their responsibility. He had been delivered. Whatever happened next was between him, the Talbot family, and God. What actually happened next would have horrified the donors who imagined orphan trains as modern miracles of Christian charity. Not every placement was a nightmare. Some children did find safety, kindness, and something close to family. Girls taken in by childless couples sometimes became beloved daughters. Boys who landed with patient farmers learned trades and inherited land. There were genuine successes, stories the society loved to tell at fundraising dinners, complete with letters of thanks written in careful schoolboy script. But there were other stories, too, ones that never made it into the annual reports. In Iowa, a 10-year-old boy named Samuel was taken by a man who needed help in his blacksmith shop. Within 6 months, Samuel had lost 2 fingers to a poorly guarded forge and been returned to the local poorhouse when infection made him too weak to work. No one informed New York. The boy simply became Iowa's problem. In Kansas, twin sisters were separated on the platform because one family wanted just the pretty one. The other twin, deemed less desirable, spent 3 more stops riding the train westward until she was finally taken by a widow who needed kitchen help. The girls never saw each other again. Neither knew where the other had gone. No forwarding addresses were recorded. In Illinois, a girl named Margaret discovered after a year that the family who had adopted her had never filed any legal paperwork. She was not their daughter. She was an indentured servant, bound to them by nothing more than the fact that she had nowhere else to go and no money for a ticket home. When she tried to run away at 14, the local sheriff brought her back and told her she owed the family gratitude and obedience. It would be another 4 years before she could leave. These were not scandals that exploded overnight. They were quiet erosions, children who wrote letters home that were never answered because home was a demolished tenement or a dead address. Children who changed their names to match their new families and lost their original identities in the process. Children who were moved from farm to farm like livestock until they were old enough to work for wages and fend for themselves. And because the system had no teeth, no inspectors, no regular audits, no legal framework to enforce oversight, nobody stopped it. By the late 1850s, a few voices began to raise concerns. Newspaper editors in towns that had hosted train stops started printing stories. One Iowa paper ran a piece in 1858 titled, "The Little Strangers, Are They Orphans or Laborers?" The article described children working 14-hour days in fields, sleeping in barns, eating scraps. It quoted a local doctor who had treated 2 train children for malnutrition and broken bones, consistent with beatings. The article was picked up by a few other papers. It caused a brief stir, then it faded, buried under more pressing news, debates over slavery, tensions between North and South, the approaching shadow of war. Brace responded to criticisms the way he always did, with confident reassurance. The vast majority of placements were successful, he insisted. A few bad cases were inevitable in any large-scale effort. The solution was not to abandon the program, but to refine it, to trust in the essential goodness of rural Christian families and the transformative power of honest work. He did not mention that refining the program mostly meant sending more trains to more towns and hoping the percentages worked out in their favor. Back in Michigan, Thomas McCarthy had stopped expecting anyone to check on him. Elijah Talbot was not a monster. He was a man who had lost a son and needed labor. He fed Thomas, gave him a place to sleep in the loft above the barn, and taught him to plow, plant, and harvest with the grim efficiency of someone who saw the boy as a tool that needed to be maintained but not cherished. Thomas worked from dawn until dusk. He ate what was left after the family finished their meals. He went to church on Sundays because it was expected, and he kept his mouth shut when the pastor asked if he was settling in well. He learned quickly that complaining accomplished nothing. The one time he asked when he might go back to New York, just to visit, he said, though he did not know what he would visit. Talbot stared at him across the supper table and said flatly, "You got no New York anymore, boy. You're here now. Make peace with it." Thomas never asked again. Over time, the edges of his old life blurred. He forgot what his mother's voice sounded like. He forgot the exact layout of the alleys around 5 Points. The lodging house became a dim memory, the train a fever dream. What remained was the farm, the fields, the endless cycle of seasons and work. And somewhere in a file cabinet in Manhattan, his name sat in a closed folder, evidence of a placement successfully completed, a problem efficiently solved. By 1860, the Children's Aid Society had sent more than 5,000 children westward. By 1875, the number had climbed past 50,000. The trains kept rolling, the platforms kept filling, and the gaps in the records kept growing. Names misspelled, addresses lost, children who simply stopped responding to letters until even the pretense of follow-up faded away. It would take decades before anyone tried to count how many had truly vanished. By then, the children were adults, scattered across a continent, many of them unable or unwilling to piece together the fractured story of how they had ended up where they were. Some did not even know they had been part of the orphan trains. They had been so young when they were placed that they believed the families who raised them were their only families, the only history they had ever had. Historians would later estimate that of the 250,000 children who rode the trains between 1854 and 1929, at least 30,000 to 50,000 left no reliable trace in the records. They became ghosts in the American landscape. Names without stories, stories without endings, children whose futures had been bought and sold on wooden platforms and then quietly erased from the books when it became inconvenient to remember they had ever existed at all. By the time the orphan trains had been running for 20 years, the most disturbing truth about them was no longer hidden on the platforms. It was hidden in plain sight, in the faces of parents who had never meant to give their children away. From the beginning, the Children's Aid Society and other agencies liked to repeat one comforting statistic. Most of the boys and girls on the trains were true orphans. No mother, no father, no one to claim them. It made the story cleaner. It made donors feel righteous, churches feel generous, newspapers feel proud to run illustrations of ragged children transformed into rosy-cheeked farm kids. The problem was that it simply wasn't true. In New York, Boston, Philadelphia, and New Orleans, poverty had its own math. A father injured on the docks or killed in a mine left a widow with no income. A mother sick with typhus or locked in a charity hospital left children with no care. In theory, placing those children temporarily in an institution until the family could get back on its feet was a mercy. In practice, that mercy came with fine print the families could not see. Take Catherine Fitzpatrick. In 1875, she stood in the crowded office of a Catholic foundling hospital with a baby on her hip and a 2-year-old clinging to her skirt. Her husband had died of a fever in the Irish shantytown where they lived, laying track for one of the very railroads that would later carry saved children west. She worked when she could, washing clothes for pennies. But winter was coming. Coal cost more every week. The baby was coughing at night. The nun behind the desk spoke kindly at first. "We can take the older boy for a time," she said. "Just until you are settled. You will visit on Sundays. We will keep him safe." Catherine hesitated. The thought of walking back to that cold room with one less child already made her stomach twist. But the boy needed food she could not provide. The nun slid a paper across the desk. "Just sign here," she said. "So we have his name, so we can keep the record straight." Catherine could not read the dense block of script. She could make out her son's name where the nun pointed, and a line for her own shaky signature. She did not see the phrase buried in the middle. Full surrender of all parental rights. Months later, when she came to visit and found his bed empty, she thought there had been a mistake. "He has been placed with a good family," the nun told her. "A farm, out west. He will be better off there." Catherine did not remember signing away her son. She did not remember anyone saying the word permanent. But the paper in the file said the choice had been made. Stories like hers multiplied as the years went on. Some parents were illiterate. Some were told the forms were just for the records. Others were given nothing at all, their children taken by police or charity workers after complaints from landlords or neighbors. These children are neglected. The society will look after them. In a city desperate to clear its streets of barefoot, ragged bodies that made polite society uncomfortable, the line between rescue and removal blurred dangerously. The demand out west encouraged that blur. Towns knew when trains were coming. Notices ran in local newspapers weeks in advance. A carload of children from New York will arrive on Wednesday next. Good Christian families wishing to take a child should apply to the committee. Church committees, women's auxiliaries, and ministers coordinated with placement agents. They promised eager audiences that a fine selection would be available. A fine selection needed numbers. It was one thing to fill 46 seats in 1854 when 5 points alone seemed to vomit up children whenever a police wagon passed through. By the 1880s and 1890s, as other reforms slowly chipped at the visible street gangs and ragged newsboys, there were fewer obviously abandoned children to draft into the program. The society's own success at scooping children off sidewalks made it harder to pretend that every pickup was an orphan with no one to care. But the trains kept running, the West kept asking, and so the definition of orphan quietly expanded. A father in a Bowery boarding house, out of work for 2 months, signed a form placing his sons, temporarily, in a mission home while he looked for a job. When he came back with steady employment at a foundry, the boys were gone. "You missed the train," the director told him bluntly. "They were chosen by good families. You should be glad." A mother with 4 children in a tenement agreed, under pressure from a visiting charity organization society worker, to let the society help with 2 of them. "Just until you can manage," she was promised. When she asked after them a year later, she was told that one had died of illness and the other was too far away to contact easily. No details, no addresses. On the platforms in Kansas, Nebraska, Minnesota, and Texas, nobody asked many questions about where exactly the children had come from or whether someone back east might come looking for them. The tags on their coats said orphan. The speeches said they had been rescued from vice and hopelessness. For farmers who had just lived through grasshopper plagues, droughts, and bank failures, that was enough. "What about their parents?" a school teacher in Ohio asked a placement agent in 1892, watching as a dozen boys waited in stiff new clothes on a station platform. The agent smiled tightly. "If a parent cared," he said, "the child would not be here." It was easier to believe that than to consider that a mother might weep herself to sleep in a city boarding house, clutching a scrap of paper with a train number and the vague promise that her son was somewhere in Indiana. The law did little to protect those ties. Adoption statutes in many states were vague or non-existent well into the late 19th century. Taking in a trained child often meant nothing more than signing a line in a minister's register or a charity ledger. There was no standardized court process, no requirement to notify out-of-state relatives, no automatic grant of citizenship or inheritance rights to the child. On paper, they were placed. In reality, most lived in a legal limbo where they belonged to everyone and no one at the same time. That limbo could be exploited in quieter, crueler ways than outright beatings or starvation. A girl might be told from the age of 8 that she was lucky to have a roof and a dress, reminded daily that she owed her adoptive parents gratitude and obedience. At 14, she might discover that while their biological daughter was being enrolled in a teacher's college, she was being placed out again, this time with a widower who needed a housekeeper. "You aren't really our blood," her first family might say. "We took you when no one else would. Now we've done our duty." A boy might grow up working from dawn until nightfall on a ranch, called son, but never allowed to forget that the land would pass to the biological heir. When he protested at 18 that he deserved a share after a decade of labor, he could be reminded that he had come with nothing, that technically no formal adoption was ever filed, that if he didn't like it, the road ran both directions. In cities, the dynamic played out differently. Some trained children were placed not with farmers, but with urban families needing cheap labor in shops, restaurants, or factories. Officially, they were apprentices. Unofficially, they were quasi-indentured, paid in board and occasional small coins, tied to their employers by dependents and the absence of any alternative. Every once in a while, the system's cracks became too wide to ignore. A case in Minnesota in the early 1900s made national headlines when a 14-year-old train girl testified in court that the man who had adopted her at age 7 had been using her as unpaid labor and worse, and that when she tried to complain to the local placement committee, they told her she must be ungrateful and threatened to send her to a reformatory. The judge, shamed by the publicity, ordered the arrangement dissolved and demanded that the agency implement stricter oversight. The agency issued a new set of guidelines: more letters, more occasional visits. On paper, things improved. On the ground, in hundreds of small towns and isolated farms, the same quiet transactions continued. By the time the orphan train movement began to wind down in the 1920s, reformers had started to talk about family preservation instead of mass relocation. Progressive social workers argued that it was better to help struggling parents keep their children than to ship those children halfway across the country. States began to pass more robust adoption laws. The last official train rolled in 1929 with far less fanfare than the first. No grand reckoning followed. No commission called every placement agency to account for missing names or broken promises. The trains were folded into a tidy narrative of American charity. Bold experiment, imperfect but well-intentioned, paving the way for modern foster care. The mothers who had never seen their sons again were not invited to speak. The men and women who had grown up under new names on faraway farms, told to be grateful and forget where they came from, were rarely asked whether they agreed with the story. The most merciless part of the orphan train era is not only that children were treated like spare labor, it is that tens of thousands of them were never meant to be there in the first place. They were not abandoned. They were removed, signed away with forms they could not read, taken for their own good by people who never planned to bring them back. And once their small bodies had filled a seat on a westbound train and a space in some stranger's ledger, the system that took them had no intention of ever tracing the line back to the lives it had cut in two.